These cats, man. You know they haven't played with that toy in months. I think it's only because I'm trying to record at 9 o'clock at night that they've decided, suddenly, this toy is the best toy they've ever heard of. Welcome to Forsaken by Shadows, a production of Stories by Sarah Danielle. Previously, on Forsaken by Shadows, from Beltel's point of view. Me? What are you asking me for? I don't remember what happened. I was 2 sheets to the wind, as my friend Stixie would say. Completely inebriated. Incapable of coherent thought. Alright, fine. You caught me. It wasn't that bad, though not for lack of trying. But if you'll remember, they made me a patrol captain, which means I actually have to care how I behave when I'm off duty. Something about being a model citizen for the Elflets to look up to. Ha! They should have thought about that before they made me a captain. But whatever. I heard a rumor the story isn't about me, so let's move on. Okay. Last time. Let's see here. Ah, yes. I wasn't around for the first part, so I can only assume it was a lot of Rizman sulking. He's quite good at sulking, but this time I can't blame him. He lost his commission, and I heard some blonde elf showed up and ruined his proposal plans. I wasn't proposing. Hey, this is my recap. Go away. Anyway, where was I? Ah, yes. Rizman was sulking. Probably told himself some lies like, oh, my cycle will get better now that I've had a nap, and it'll be easy to share all my deepest fears and darkest feelings with Mazira in the middle of a crowd before the biggest daily ritual of our community. So then he would have walked all the way to the temple, probably with Tiana, and then he would have reunited with his one true love, only to be reminded that her blonde shadow is never far behind anymore. Then everyone else would have showed up, and he would have been way too scared to ask Torafane if he knows anything about his commission. So instead he waits for Solaran, who proves to be absolutely useless and cancels their little family party because of the council meeting. And that's where I come back into the story, because now it's time for the commissioning ceremony that I've been dreading all cycle. And after receiving one last passive-aggressive threat regarding any scenes I may or may not have been planning, we all assemble for the oaths. And I behave myself very well, thank you very much. I say my oaths and suffer through the insufferable name that they christen me with. Mind Slayer? Really? I sound like one of those stuffy wizard types. They're going to call my patrol the Slayers, like we'd run around staking vampires or something. Which is actually not outside the realm of our job description. Anyway, at least the stuffy part is over, and now we can head to the tavern and party. And for a brief, beautiful moment, everything is fine. And then Blondie stops by and whisks Mazira away, and you guessed it, Rizman sulks about it. And he wanders off to a corner, and then Arden joins him, and they sulk together over Elistrea knows what. They sulk so hard it dampens my undampable spirits. So I resolved to do something about it. So I stride over there. Well, I wobble over there. And demand to know what's wrong, even though I already know. And while I still maintain 90% of Rizman's problems would go away if he just started a bar fight, he seems to think otherwise. And then they just casually mention that the council's probably meeting over them, and the reason why Rizman was removed from the commission, and I get a sudden stroke of genius. We should go eavesdrop on the council, because if there's one thing you can guarantee about a structure made by evil drow, it's that it's full of secret rooms and spy holes, and Arden and I know just where to go to find one. Forsaken by Shadows, Part 3, Where Shadows Linger, Chapter 10. The Council Meeting. Rizman. Barely half a shade after the decision to eavesdrop was made, Rizman found himself kneeling behind a natural outcropping of stone on the edge of the temple compound, with Arden on his right and Beltel on his left. The grounds were nearly deserted this late in the red light, but not completely empty. Here and there a few songblades drifted, and of course, there were always the guards at the door. The three of them were as still as the stone they hid behind, studying the cleric's movement with expert attention, albeit attention that was still hazed by black shroom ale. But Launa being Launa, there were no patrols to account for or any increased security measures, though that didn't make Risman feel any more at ease. He and the others had no legitimate reason to be here, and though he couldn't speak for Arden, he knew he and Beltel weren't the most pious of citizens. If anyone stopped them to ask what they were doing, he doubted they believed they'd come here to pray. Fortunately, they'd all agreed they didn't want to be seen. Not through the front door, not in the chapel, and definitely not skulking around the statue of Elistrea. "That window," Beltel murmured, pointing to one on the east side of the temple. "It shouldn't be any trouble to slip through it." Risman nodded, agreeing with the assessment. The window was in the middle of the architecture, and if he recalled correctly, would put them in a classroom that led to a hallway that would take them to a side entrance into the chapel. "There's probably only 3 songblades in the chapel at this hour," Arden added. "The harpist and 2 acolytes." "Shouldn't be too hard," Risman said. "Then let's get to it," Beltel said, and they rose as one, slinking through the shadows. It wasn't hard to get to the window unseen, as no one lurked on this side of the grounds, though the paved walkways and crystal gardens extended this far. The silence and shadows were plenty, and the towering quartz formations offered ample opportunities to hide just in case. Within minutes, they were pressed against the wall, with Beltel in the lead. The new captain slid a thin dagger from his belt and wedged it under the window pane, sawing it up and down as he attempted to pry it open. Risman and Arden flanked him, each keeping watch in opposite directions. So far, so good. The window pane popped with a sound that seemed to echo in the cavern, and they froze, exchanging horrified looks. "Go! Go!" Risman signed to Beltel, who hurriedly leapt through the opening. Risman followed with Arden close behind, who slammed the window shut. They were indeed in a classroom, and as the window closed they scattered in separate directions, diving under cover. Risman ducked beneath a book-laden table by the door, turning just in time to see Beltel vanish behind the teacher's desk and Arden slip into a storage closet. And then they waited, certain the sound of the window would attract attention. Several minutes passed, and nothing happened. Risman's heartbeat returned to its normal pace, and he tentatively poked his head out. Arden peered from his closet, and their eyes met. "Clear?" the Gloamdrow signed. Risman nodded, and they melted from their hiding places. Beltel rose to join them, taking the lead once more. He moved to the door and opened it the barest of cracks, before pulling it wide enough to slip through. "Clear," he signed as he stepped into the hall. Sconces of fairy fire lit the empty passageway with violet hues, the dancing shadow and light playing tricks on Risman's eyes. Every shimmering flicker made him flinch, as though a cleric was coming around the corner any second, ready with a reprimand. But as they filed down the corridor, no one accosted them. In fact, it was all going a little too smoothly, which only made the hairs on the back of Risman's neck stand up higher. They took a turn to the right, and then Beltel stopped outside of another door. "Prayer room," he indicated, easing it open and glancing inside. It must have been empty, for he vanished a moment later. Risman was just about to follow when something brushed against his calf and he nearly jumped out of his skin. His hand went automatically to his dagger, even though there wasn't a single soul in Launa that he would actually want to harm with it. Not even the culprit of his fright. Silverpaw, the cursed feline, stared up at him with luminous, accusing eyes. "Tss," he hissed, nudging the cat away from him with his toe. Arden hit his arm. "What are you doing?" his hands exclaimed. Confused, Risman just stared at him, while Silverpaw glowered at his feet. "Don't you know the cats are emissaries of Elistrea?" "So?" Risman shrugged. "This one is a nuisance." To his surprise, Arden looked scandalized, dropping to his knees and rubbing Silverpaw's ears affectionately. "He didn't mean it," he whispered to the cat. "You are a beautiful creature." Risman just gaped at him, until Beltel stuck his face back out into the hall. "What are you two doing?" he said. "Get in here before you're seen!" They hurried in, and Risman made sure to shut the door before the cat could follow. "The cat's report to the Dark Maiden herself," Arden signed as soon as they were in the room. "How can you be so rude to them?" Risman blinked. He knew the animals were sacred to Elistrea, but they were just that, animals. It wasn't like Lolth's spiders, whose eyes the Demon Queen was said to spy through. True, they seemed slightly more intelligent than you would have expected an animal to be, but their interest in the happenings going on around them was nominal at best. What would the cats possibly be reporting to anyone? How much food hadn't been left out for them? Who had dared to touch their bellies? "They're also tattletales," Beltel said, purposely using the wrong hand symbol for tail. He seemed rather amused by his own pun, for an elf who had just spent the better part of the red light lamenting his own pun of a captain's name. "So we should get out of here before it runs off and fetches a priestess." "Tattletales," Risman repeated, using the correct word as they moved to the door across the room. "You can't be serious." Based on the dark look that passed between Arden and Beltel, they were. Risman tossed up his hands in surrender, and they were at the final obstacle, the door into the chapel. As their unofficial leader, Beltel went first, cracking the door and reporting his observations. "Oholia is on the harp," he signed, though Risman wasn't quite sure who Oholia was. At this point, he'd probably know her if he saw her, but Beltel was blocking the view. "Her back is to us. Looks like Rezika and Galeen are chatting by the main entrance. I don't see anyone else, but they're going to notice if we just stroll in." He shut the door and turned to the others. "Suggestions?" "We need a distraction," Risman signed at once, and the three of them looked around as if a distraction would magically materialize out of thin air. When it became apparent there was nothing in the room but furniture and a display of crystal arrangements, Arden tentatively raised his hands. "I could go out there and start up a conversation." "Absolutely not," Beltel signed emphatically. "You're 50% the reason we're here." Arden just shrugged, and Risman suspected he'd been hoping for an excuse to get out of their mission. His commitment had wavered on the journey to the temple, an affliction Beltel had quietly insinuated, in sign language, behind Arden's back, was a result of Arden's growing up in Launa, where rules were actually enforced. "We could always wait until they're not looking," Risman suggested, though even as he signed it, he didn't like the idea. The longer it took them to get into the spy hole, the more valuable information they were missing in the meeting. Beltel shook his head, apparently coming to a similar conclusion. "Who knows how long that might take?" In the stillness that followed, a single sound cut through the silence. They jumped as if the door had burst open. There was only the muffled cry of the cat on the other side of the wall. Arden's hand went to his heart while Beltel rubbed his forehead. Risman, on the other hand, had a sudden idea. They needed a distraction, right? Grinning, he went to the door and wrenched it open, finding the gray tabby seated just outside, staring up at him with her big silver eyes. Behind him, he sensed the waving hands of his protesting companions, but he ignored them. "Hey, Silverpaw," he said, putting on his best smile as he knelt. "You want to be friends, right?" At least, that's what Mazira insisted, whenever he complained about the feline's unwanted attention. He'd always assumed the creature found immense joy in tormenting him, but desperate times called for desperate measures. The cat's ears flicked forward, and he chose to interpret that as a sign of interest. "If you do me a favor, I'll be nicer to you." Her ears went flat and she hissed, before getting to her paws and stalking away. Disappointed, Risman stood and shut the door. When he turned back, Arden was staring at him aghast, while Beltal just shook his head and cracked the chapel door open again. "Now she's definitely going to turn on us," the Gloamdrow protested. "It's just a cat," Risman replied, though his motions reflected his bitterness. He really would have been nicer to the feline if she had played along. Ah well, her loss. How much trouble can it cause? "Gentlemen," came Beltal's sudden signal. He turned to face them, wearing a wicked grin. "The fates have smiled upon us. The Songblades are gone." Risman and Arden rushed to the door, and, sure enough, there was no one in the chapel but the priestess playing the ever-present harp, whose back was to them. They didn't take time to question their fortunes. They just seized the opportunity, hurrying into the chapel and crouching low, so the rows of benches would obscure their silhouettes. Without the drifting eyes of the Song Sisters, it was embarrassingly easy to get behind the massive statue. In no time at all, they had crossed the chapel and stood together, staring at the blank stone wall, completely hidden behind the legs of the idol. "So, now what?" Risman signed, failing to see anything but solid rock before them. He tingled with anticipation, and though a voice in the back of his head suggested this was a terrible idea, he dismissed it. His hunger for answers in the Black Shroom Ale far outweighed his sense of self-preservation. Beltal was already on his knees, feeling the seams of the bricks. He paused just long enough to sign, "It's around here somewhere," though he frowned, evidently not finding what he sought. Arden sighed, then nudged Beltal aside and took his place. He spread his fingers and placed one hand up into the left of his position, and then another one center right. When he pressed against the wall, the stone slid silently back, revealing a hidden door. Beltal raised an eyebrow and glanced at Risman. "Methinks he has done this before," he signed with a conspiratorial smile. Risman had just returned his grin when a sudden, bright light brought his heartbeats to a screeching halt. Arden swore under his breath as a spark appeared in the seam of the newly revealed trapdoor, and it didn't take them long to ascertain the problem. The spy hole had been trapped. The spark raced up and up, though what exactly would happen when it reached its destination, Risman could only assume, but he doubted it was good. He stood frozen, wavering between trying to stop whatever disaster was coming and abandoning the adventure with an attempted escape. Beltal and Arden chose disaster prevention. They lunged forward as one, slamming their hands on the seam as if they could catch the spark and smother it, but to no avail. With a mounting dread, their eyes widened as the light sped out of reach, and then water drenched them from behind, effectively snuffing out the spark. At least, Risman was drenched, his hair dripping and the back of his coat and shirt clinging uncomfortably to his skin. The others had been in front of him, and both being shorter in stature, they escaped the majority of the splash. Judging by their pensive expressions, however, there was more to worry about than the mysterious liquid attack. Slowly, Risman turned to see what they were seeing, and for a brief moment, his tension eased as he found Tiana standing behind them. She clutched a pewter cup in her hand, one he recognized from beside the basin of holy water in the vestibule. His sense of relief evaporated when he caught sight of her rage-contorted features. She tucked the cup into the crook of her arms and signed with angry spasms. "What are you idiots doing? You're not allowed back here!" "Tiana!" Beltal signed, shifting to stand in front of the spy hole as if he could block the door from view. "What a marvelous surprise! What are you doing here?" "Following you!" she snapped, her eyes full of accusation. "I saw you three slink out of the tavern and feared you were up to no good. Apparently, I was right." At least Arden had the sense to look ashamed. Beltal just waved his hand dismissively, and that was about the moment Risman remembered how much ale he'd had to drink, and how much he probably shouldn't be leading this discussion with the girl who had the power to ruin them all. "You weren't following us," the new captain signed with cheerful gestures. "Otherwise, you would have had to come through the window like we did, and we would have noticed." Which was literally not the point. and Risman could have strangled Beltel. He was going to get them turned in. Arden might have struggled with mischief, but Tiana didn't have a mischievous bone in her body. If there was one thing he could count on, it was that anything he said or did in front of her, good or bad, would be reported straight to Solarin. Though for a girl who didn't know the meaning of mischief, how had she known to bring the water to douse the trap? Tiana's gaze narrowed with contempt. It didn't have to come through the window, because if you hadn't been so drunk, you might remember the temple is open to anyone at any time. Seriously, all I had to do was walk in here and wait for Silverpaw to tell me where you were. No one even cared. At the mention of the cat, Beltel and Arden shot Risman withering looks, which he studiously ignored as he addressed Tiana. I'm not drunk, he began, because he definitely didn't want that rumor getting back to Solarin. Or Mizira, for that matter. He might be a little tipsy, but definitely not drunk. But before he could concoct an excuse, Beltel was signing again. I am quite drunk, it's true, he admitted, and Risman resisted the urge to smack his head into the wall. However, I am still sober enough to do this. With lightning reflexes, Beltel dove forward and grabbed Tiana, spinning her around and pinning her against his body with one hand over her mouth. On instinct, Risman dove for the pewter cup, catching it before it hit the ground and gave them all away. Tiana let out a muffled cry of alarm as Beltel dragged her toward the spy hole. I've got her! Let's go! He whispered, before vanishing into the narrow room. Risman just stared after them, completely and utterly stunned. Arden caught his eye, looking just as astonished, before shaking his head. I think things just got out of hand, he signed in shaky motions. We'd better hurry before it gets worse. And then he, too, disappeared into the spy hole. Not knowing what else to do, Risman followed suit. The spy hole was certainly not designed with 4 fully grown adults in mind, and with Risman's larger frame, they were crammed uncomfortably close into what essentially amounted to a cloak closet. Tiana was still pressed against Beltel's body, her eyes blazing and full of hate-filled tears, which she aimed directly at Risman. Risman flinched, sliding the hidden door back into place and plunging them into darkness. I'm sorry, he breathed, as her form lit up furiously hot in his infravision. I'll explain later, I promise. I won't, Beltel muttered, his voice full of glee. You'll deserve it for being meddlesome. Shut up, Arden hissed, or they'll... You would see us all destroyed! The shout from the council room beyond made them all stiffen. The voice belonged to a male, but Risman didn't recognize it. He did recognize the wrath in his tone, however. Someone was quite upset. I would see my people safe, came the iron-cool voice of Mother Lara. By letting the mercenaries in to wreak havoc on our society? Countered the first speaker. No, Reverend Mother, this is too extreme of a solution. Risman and the others leaned in, captivated. Even Tiana's anger had faded, and Beltel had gone so far as to let her go, completely drawn in by the conversation they weren't meant to be a part of. Too far? Said a new voice, a squeaky female that Risman thought probably belonged to the gnome wife who had raised Zales. Fifinia, he thought her name was. Some of our best are dead, Tiamas. We don't know who did it or how many are out there. The words were more chilling than Tiana's holy water. Judging by the way everyone shifted, Risman wasn't alone in his shock. People were dead? Who? When? Where? You're right, we don't know, argued Tiamas. Which is why I don't understand why you're pushing us to reach out to those sellswords. For all we know, it's a lone ranger who happened upon our songblades. You want to invite criminals inside our walls to scout our numbers and defenses and sell it to our enemies. We have a long-standing relationship with Bregan de Arth, Mother Lara said, her voice still even, but sounding strained. If they were going to betray us, they would have done so by now. Someone snorted derisively, and there were other discontented murmurs. Risman didn't blame them. His lingering sense of dread returned with a vengeance with every word spoken, and he was finding it difficult to absorb the news. Launa had an agreement with Brigandaarth? But they were evil. They'd coerced him into murdering a woman over supplies, something that still kept him up at red light. It was like mud had been splashed on one of Solarin's masterpiece tapestries, the beauty forever marred. How could the sanctuary work with such people? "I understand your concerns," said Mother Lara, silencing the mutters. "But the risk is great. There could be a mere scout, as Tiamas has suggested, or there could be a full patrol, or even an army. We've never had enemies so close to our door, and I'd rather not risk any more of our people's lives." "So send the militia," said Tiamas. "That's why we have them. It's their job to risk their lives for us." Beltel's lips curled in what looked like disgust, apparently not appreciating the councilman's comment. Risman agreed with his sentiments, but he was too distracted by Mother Lara's comment to reply. Enemies at the door? A whole army? Fear like he hadn't known since Teloriel had found him in the wilds crept over his bones. No, there couldn't be evil drow outside the sanctuary's gates, threatening his perfect life. He'd escaped the danger. He'd been saved. He couldn't lose it all now, just when he was on the threshold of pure and lasting joy. And what about Mazira? What would this news do to her? He closed his eyes as images of her return to chains flashed unbidden into his mind, and cold sweat beaded on his forehead. Within the council room, a chorus of protests rose up in response to Tiamas's words, but Risman only caught snatches of what was being said. It seemed some were in agreement. The militia ought to be mobilized, while others felt the councilman's words had implied the soldiers were expendable. "May I speak, Reverend Mother?" The voice was quiet, but unmistakably Solarin's, and a hush fell. Solarin must have received silent acknowledgement, for he continued as though given permission, his voice now more resonant as he addressed the council. "Friends, we have fallen into the trap of speaking in circles, and the hour grows late. The Reverend Mother desires only to preserve the lives of our community, as she has always sought." He paused as people began to protest, but the hubbub trailed away before it truly began. "But we simply do not have enough information," Solarin continued. "Torafane has already offered to lead a strike team to investigate. Why not allow him to go? I believe we can trust our elites to stay out of sight of threats they cannot handle, and I will personally volunteer to go on behalf of the Songblades. If the threat is greater than we can handle, then I will support your motion to contact the mercenaries." Tiana let out a little gasp, clapping her hands over her mouth. Risman placed a hand on her shoulder, giving her a comforting squeeze, forgetting she was livid with him. She didn't seem to mind, however, but leaned into his presence. Yet he himself wasn't terribly worried. As soft as he'd come to learn Solarin was, Risman would never forget the priest's cool composure in the face of Mindroctovin. He would take Solarin on a strike team any day. Emalara, however, did not agree. "No," she said at once. "I will not risk the lives of any more citizens of Lona, and especially not yours, Solarin. Your magic is too rare of a gift, and we have lost 4 such gifted in one attack." "4?" Tiana breathed, her shoulders dropping. The shift in hues of Arden and Beltel showed the blood had drained from their faces as well. Not only were 4 of their citizens dead, but it was 4 of their powerful, faithful, magic-wielding anomalies. Women like Mazira and Tiana were training to be, who, Risman suddenly realized, were probably friends with Tiana and Mazira. Then a new voice cut through the murmuring, hard and gravelly. "But for a few hours, it might have been the corpse of my son Satara brought back to us this blue light." The voice belonged to Torafane, and if Risman thought silence had fallen when Solarin spoke, It was nothing to the quiet that followed in the wake of his words. Beside him, Arden shifted, his expression troubled. "Vote how you will, councillors," Torfane continued. "But I will be investigating. Even if you vote to close the gates, you cannot stop me." Arden shook his head, his jaw clenched and his brow furrowed. As if echoing his frustration, several councillors started speaking at once, and it was a few minutes before Mother Lara was able to call them back to order. "Torfane, your concern is appreciated, though your defiance is not," she said, when she finally regained control of the forum. "I allowed you and Solaran your excursion last year, but that doesn't entitle you to act on your own whenever you want. And yet there are few warriors within our walls more qualified for the task than Torfane," Solaran argued. "I am not downplaying the threat, Reverend Mother." His words were delivered with an air of an argument he'd already had to make. "I am only asking for an abundance of caution. Let us gather intelligence and then make an informed choice on how to proceed." "I say we take it to a vote," came Tiamas's voice. There were murmurs of agreement. "Fine," Mother Lara said, her words edged with steel. "We will vote to send Torfane and a team of his choosing on a reconnaissance mission to ascertain the level of threat, and then decide our course of action when they return. However, I am stipulating that you may not go, Solaran. I need you here." Solaran sounded like he started to protest, but for once, Torfane's voice overpowered him. "Agreed. Then let's vote." Beltel stirred, glancing at them and beckoning for them to follow. "We need to get out of here. After they vote, they'll dismiss." "But I want to hear the results," Tiana signed. "Whatever they decide will be public knowledge by morning," Arden argued. "Beltel's right." They waited until Beltel signaled it was clear, and then all but fled from behind the statue and into the prayer room, the need for the overabundance of stealth long forgotten. Once safe within the room, they stood for a moment, just staring at one another, as the full weight of what they overheard began to sink in. 4 Songblades were dead, and it could be the fault of anything from a rogue attacker to the heralds of a full-scale invasion. Whatever had happened, it had Mother Lara spooked enough that she'd wanted to bring in mercenaries to deal with it. Solaran, who hated leaving the comforts of his soft silks, was concerned enough to actually volunteer to go, and Torfane had risked open defiance to make his point. They were all in grave danger, and no one was talking about it yet. "We didn't hear anything," Beltel said, so serious he could have been his brother. He caught each of their eyes with a meaningful look. "Understand? We didn't hear anything." Risman nodded, understanding completely. He understood now why Solaran had been so nervous earlier as well, and why he had refused to speak of anything before it was time. This secret was too big to let leak. It could cause unmitigated panic. Mazira wasn't the only one whose fragile peace was at stake. The whole city was made up of people who'd experienced terrible things at the hands of Drow. They made their way out the same way they came in, parting ways with Tiana in the hall, though she assured Risman she'd be waiting to walk home with him. Her cold refusal to acknowledge Beltel hinted at the return of her anger, but he couldn't even begin to dredge up trepidation over a lecture when so much more was going on. So many things were starting to make sense. The one thing he couldn't figure out was what all of this had to do with him and why he couldn't join the militia. Thank you for listening to this episode of Forsaken by Shadows, written and produced by me, Sarah Danielle. And thank you to Tabletop Audio and Pixabay, and my cats, for the use of their audio in this production. As always, Forsaken by Shadows is unofficial fan content not endorsed by Wizards of the Coast. Risman's past appears to be catching up with him. though he hasn't quite figured it all out yet. But is it really Teloriel stalking them out in the darkness? Or does someone else have a penchant for crescent-shaped cuts on the side of a face? Subscribe to follow along and find out what happens next.